the next critical that we understand and fundamental and very important, can't overemphasize this important topic that we want to cover in anatomy and physiology, especially as we talk about physiology, is this term homeostasis. And what homeostasis basically is the body maintaining a stable internal environment in order to keep all of our different factors that contribute to life in balance and within ranges that will keep us healthy. So there's literally thousands of things going on in the body, and all of them are trying to stay within a certain range of what would be normal, and our body is constantly maintaining these normal ranges by different means, and it's primarily using our nervous system and our endocrine system to do this, but it is working this in all of our systems. When we have an imbalance of this, then basically that's what creates disease or even possibly death. So maintaining a stable internal environment. So we'll be talking about how the body does that. That'll be a major topic. We'll continue the rest of this semester. When we look at homeostasis, we see that there are several different parts to it. So we want to start out by looking at the variable. Now, the variable is the thing that can be thousands of different things going on in the body. Whether that would be something like our body temperature being the variable, our blood pressure being the variable, how much fluid balance we have, water in the body. There can be many, again, thousands of possibilities of what the variable is that our body is trying to maintain a certain range in. So looking at our structure here, we see that we have a variable. We want to keep it in balance, but there's some sort of factor that, or response, or some sort of change that causes us to go out of balance. Let's say our body temperature has a certain range that we can stay in, but if it becomes out of balance by going too high or too low, then our body knows that because we have receptors, and again, we said our skin was the biggest sensory organ, and there are receptors all throughout our skin that would detect our external environment and our body temperature. When it detects our body temperature, then it will send information to a control center. Now, in this particular case, the control center would be a specific portion of the brain called the hypothalamus. There are other control centers, but the hypothalamus would be one of the major or the major control center in the body, even though there are other control centers, and the control center could even be part of our endocrine system. But in this case, we're talking about body temperature, so the control center would be in the hypothalamus, which would be related to our nervous system. The control center then would basically determine what is going on with the temperature. Is this within the acceptable range, or is it getting close to the parameters of the higher low points of the range, and do we need to do something about it? If it's decided that a response needs to happen, something needs to be done, then that's when our effectors come into play, and our control center basically activates our effectors, and then the effectors send a response that brings us back into balance. Again, briefly, one of the major parts of homeostasis is actually having receptors that again, these receptors are either going to be part of our neural system, through nerves, neurons, or it could be part of our hormonal control systems that actually come from our glands, but also work with our nervous system in a lot of ways. But the receptors are going to be what is going to notice and respond to some sort of change. And of course, it's active all the time. It's monitoring everything all the time, but it will send a response to the control center wherever that should be, again, according if we're talking about the neural system or the hormonal endocrine system. Again, the control system, or the control center, is where we kind of have a genetically predetermined set point of what is normal for us. Now, as a human species, we all have certain ranges that we would all fall within, But as individuals, we even have our own individual set points for different things going on in our body. So what's going to go on at the control center is once the information is sent from the receptor, it's going to analyze that information, and then it's going to determine, does it need to do something about that, and how strong of an effect does it actually need to respond to. So if there is an effect that needs to happen, then our effectors become activated. That could be anything from a nerve message being sent to a hormone being released. But what the effector is going to do is try to correct the imbalance that we've come across. The homeostasis is actually controlled by what we call feedback loops, and there are positive and negative feedback loops. The negative feedback loop is by far used more than the positive feedback loop, and so it's going to be what we're going to see happening in the body most. And what the negative feedback loop does is it tries to do the opposite of the original stimulus. In other words, let's say if our body temperature gets too high, then a negative feedback loop would try to make it lower. If our body temperature got too low, a negative feedback loop would try to make it higher. If our blood pressure got too high, a negative feedback loop would make it lower. If our blood pressure got too low, a negative feedback loop would try to make it higher. If we had too much of something, a negative feedback loop would cause us to have less of it. If we have too little of something, a negative feedback loop would cause us to have more of it. So again, we will see many examples of this, but this is the most common type of feedback loop. Positive feedback loops are much less common, but necessary nonetheless. So the example of a positive feedback loop, or what a positive feedback loop does, is once a stimulus starts, it actually increases the stimulus until there is some sort of completion. So a couple of examples that you should be able to relate to right now is, if a baby is getting ready to be born and contractions start, they actually get closer and closer together. We reinforce the original stimulus until the birth of the baby. Or, if somebody has cut themselves and their blood starts clotting, it continues clotting. The stimulus of clotting continues until the clotting is completed. So whereas negative feedback loops do the opposite of the stimulus, positive feedback loops actually increase the stimulus into some sort of completion. Here's a really good example of a typical negative feedback loop, and one that most people can relate to. Again, if we notice homeostasis, our variable, being normal body temperature, and then we have a stimulus. In this case, we have a stimulus that causes our temperature to rise, and obviously there's many things that can do that, anything from exercising to going out in the heat to many variables, putting on too many clothes. Many things can actually stimulate our receptors to detect that our body temperature would be rising. Now, receptors, which are going to be in our skin, they're going to actually send information to the control center. In this case, it's a specific part of the brain called the hypothalamus, and a specific part of the hypothalamus called the thermoregulatory center. And what this center does is it basically monitors our body temperature, knowing that we have a certain range that it considers normal. But if something starts going to one extreme or the other part of the normal range, then it will prepare to send information via an effector to do the opposite of whatever the stimulus is. Now, in this case, since the rising body temperature was occurring, and this was taking us to the upper limits of our normal range, then the control center, the hypothalamus, actually sent messages via nerves through, which were the effectors, and it basically sent them to a couple places. It actually sent them to our blood vessels in our skin. It caused them to dilate. That's why we get red when we run or when we're, in a hot situation. Those of us that are fair skin, we tend to be able to see the blood vessels getting closer to the surface of the skin. And then we also send information that causes us to start releasing sweat, and then the sweat carries the heat away from our body through something called evaporative cooling. But of course, what's actually happening here is we are doing the opposite of the body temperature rising by our blood vessels dilating, dissipating heat away from our body, by the sweat carrying the heat away from our body, then this results in cooling the body down. Therefore, we are bringing the body back into balance, into that normal temperature range. The rest of what we have here in our PowerPoints will actually be covered in lab, so we'll just cover these very briefly, understanding that we are going to go over them in more detail and a little bit slower in lab. So we do need to understand that anatomy has its own language, and we need to understand these terms, and once we understand the terms, it'll make learning what the body parts do and why they're named, what they are, it'll make that a little bit easier. Some of these terms are very intuitive. You've used them your whole life, but some of them are extremely important, especially how they're applied in anatomy and physiology. So read through these terms. For this particular slide, you will see the terms superior and inferior attached to a lot of structures, and you'll definitely see the terms anterior, and in the human body, it is basically synonymous with being ventral or towards the belly side. So anterior or front, ventral or belly side for the human would be the same, whereas posterior or dorsal being backside, posterior being the backside also, of course, and these are kind of synonymous in the human body. So again, all of these terms you will see over and over, and you will see them used in naming certain anatomical features. Now, a few other very important terms is medial, meaning towards a midline. If you drew a midline down the middle of somebody, whatever is towards that would be medial. Lateral then would be away from that midline. Proximal would be close to the trunk of the body, and instead of intermediate, I wish they had put the term distal, because it's kind of the opposite of proximal. So we would say something proximal is closer to the trunk, something distal would be further away. These things can become important, especially when studying things like muscles. Here are some very common landmarks on the front side, anterior side of the body. So familiarize yourself with the terms and what is referring to, and again, we will go over these in more detail in lab. We live in a three-dimensional world, so we can actually divide our body up into three body planes. The sagittal, or in this case mid-sagittal, because it's separating the body into equal left and right parts. The frontal, which is separating the front and back of the body, also called the coronal plane. And then the transverse plane, which is basically separating the top from the bottom of the body. And of course, that can be moved in different sections. But this is particularly important when we're talking about medical imaging or imagery. And so we'll know kind of what perspective we're actually seeing the body from. The body actually, has several cavities inside of it. And these cavities are important because they actually allow the specialization of the organs to develop. And it also helps us classify where things are at in the body and how things are related. So notice that we basically have a dorsal body cavity. What's going on in the back side, even though it does go up into the actual brain cavity, cranial cavity area, that seems like part of that's anterior, but if you look at the majority of this space, it does connect through the vertebrae, actually surround this, and the skull surrounds these two cavities. Then we have the ventral body cavity, which again means belly side, or the anterior side of the body, and we actually do see it's divided up into the thoracic cavity, which is closed off, not completely, but separates it from the abdominopelvic cavity by the diaphragm. In our abdominal pelvic cavity, we see that the upper portion is the abdominal cavity, the lower portion is the pelvic cavity. We can actually divide our abdominal pelvic area into quadrants, or 4 different parts. So one really important thing that we need to make clear here now is that when we say right, we mean the picture's right, the patient's right, the other person's right. not necessarily our perspective,